Every 2,000 feet, complete revolution of the big is.
That's right.
I think it was like, I would probably that we could have done more.
That's a Robert Kennedy.
All plays ball.
I said,
So what's the company?
You see, we're at 2,000 feet. 9 feet left.
Next slide will show that side. And showing my story of the horse.
I said nobody else.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually writing. He was from school. I never followed that. You're ready. You're ready. It was
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Wow.
Good morning.
Nice to see everybody here. Anybody, you ready? Anybody else wants a bagel, please? There's plenty of bagel left, I think. If you want to get one, I'll give you a couple of seconds to get a bagel if you want. Okay, for those of you who don't know, for those who know, I'm Joe Morse. I'm the president of Brotherhood. And I get to speak first for that, I guess. We're very lucky today, as every time. We have some fabulous members in our temple and brotherhood. And we're gonna hear from two of them today, two of the many we have. And I want to thank all of them for coming. You know, Alan Zarrow has just been fantastic to us since we've consolidated. And his presentations are just unbelievable. We'll see another one today. So those people on Zoom, welcome. Those people in person, welcome. Thank you all for coming. And we also have another fantastic member of the venue we have. And I'm going to introduce now Ron. I'm a wonderful book historian. And Ron's going to tell you all about the wonderful good friend, Alan Zarrow. So Ron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joel, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm sure that most of the people who are sitting here and those of you on Zoom have seen and witnessed several of Alan's presentations over the years, even before consolidation of our congregation. And as you know, I'm a Brooklyn historian. Alan is a cemetery historian. And Alan travels around our United States of America, and besides sightseeing, he visits cemeteries, and he photographs, and he jots down all the history. And I asked Alan a question, and I said, if a time machine would be invented, would you like to go back in time and interview the people?
Oh, wait, I got
That's
on mute.
Well, you said that would be a great idea. Now, I would love to go back in time as a Brooklyn historian with a camera to turn of the century Brooklyn. But the time machine, I'd like to be, and I think Alan said this also, we'd like to be the third person to try out the time machine. We want to make sure the first two come back. Otherwise, what's the purpose of coming back? Well, Alan has gone into the past by visiting the sites that he has presented in his programs. And unfortunately, unless there's a time machine invented, I now present our own Alan Zarrow.
Thank you, Ron. Everybody, okay, I can hear it, so I know everybody's going out. Thank you. I always say that it's a big treat for me to be introduced by somebody who actually has the word historian after his name, so I thank you, Ron. Today is April 14th. Today is the 159th anniversary. Why would anybody want to see me? Hi, Greg.
Shankar is requesting remote control of your screen. The nerve.
We're going to say decline.
Please.
There we go. Sorry, Diane.
Sorry, may not take it.
I have never had this, Diane is back.
I'm gonna ask you.
Okay. Sorry, folks. The good news is that we are all back in person. This is my first in-person lecture since 2019. So Ron, anything that goes wrong, you'll be fine next month. Today is April 14th. Today is the 159th anniversary of the shooting of Abraham Lincoln. Today is the 79th anniversary of FDR's funeral. And I heard on the radio today is also Jackie Robinson Day. Okay, so they were wrong. They were wrong. Okay, so they're wrong. Diane is interfering with my...
If she does it again, I'll kick her out. And knock it off. Pressing the wrong button.
In the meantime, hello to my cousins from out of town. I saw you on the screen. All right, so what's on your tables? On your tables, you have found an agenda for today. So as we're going down, keep track, but anybody here from the Board of Ed, you also know what you used to do with agendas. So I expect to see a lot of great artwork at the end of this from all your doodling. Also on the table is a list of references, a timetable for the events that happened on April 12th, 1945, and also a list of the cast of characters, what they did, where they're buried. And if anybody, I know there are not enough here, and of course the people on Zoom don't have it at all. Yeah, please share the agenda so you know how far we've gotten. I'm trying to get us out of here by 12:15 Eastern time. Glory. At any rate, if anybody on Zoom wants any copies of this, please get in touch with me and I will send it out back to you as an attachment to an email. All right. What are some of the goofy things? Well, everybody is settling in, everybody is getting their sounds all set. You know, I usually do a quickie of what I did this past summer. So, my referee conference this year was in Southern California, and one of the things I was really happy to do in 4 different cemeteries, I managed to get, on 3 different cemeteries, I managed to get 4 of the original members of the Three Stooges. But if you're talking about Southern California, you have to also talk about Superman and the actual Daily Planet building, for anybody that remembers the TV show. I did find George Reeves, and because Joel Edelstein keeps knocking me about me and my camera, I also found the grave of Jimmy Olsen. In Glendale, California, they would not let me into the mausoleum where Michael Jackson is ensconced, but I did find, for all of our baseball fans, I did pay a visit to the old professor. Outside of San Diego, I found the man who Ron likes to call the most admired baseball player in Brooklyn baseball history. But in Southern California, I still found the person who is probably still the most hated man in Brooklyn history. All right, as always, I have my big list of thank yous for today. Joel Moss and the Brotherhood for inviting me here today. Mike Rose for doing the Zoom hookups. Gene and Angel. Angel's not here today, I understand, but for setting this up for today for all of us, and I think that was great. Bonnie, as always, excuse me, who endured my annual fetching, but of course, Miriam Mishkin every year for helping me do this, but I have a very special thank you to Rabbi Heidi and Mike, who helped me get the original version of this thing onto a digital format 8 years ago. Thank you, Mike. To anyone who took any of the photos that will be seen here today, right, Shelley? And in advance, anybody with any personal recollection, if you do, you're probably on Zoom. Mickey Platt, if you have any recollections, please join in. Maddie, if you're on, please join in. The founders of the website Find a Grave, Dean Kine, I really have to thank for creating a wonderful flyer that was in the lobby. And finally, for all of you being here today, a quick word of caution. FDR is a polarizing figure. There is always the discussion of him and his relationships with the Jews, the USS St. Louis, the bombing or not bombing of the concentration camps. Folks, politics off limits today. Okay, can we do that, please? This talk today is about one day in FDR's life. Unfortunately, it was the worst day of FDR's life. All right, let's get started. Our story begins in Dutchess County, New York. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States, was born on January 30th, 1882, in this room, in his family home at Hyde Park, New York, known as Springwood. As you can see, this is what the mansion looked like back then. We all know that it has changed a lot since that time. This is what you will see when you get there. He was the son of James Roosevelt. James was married to a young lady by the name of Rebecca Howland, and that union produced a son by the name of James Roosevelt, known as Rosie. What most people don't know is that FDR had a stepbrother. When Rebecca passed away, he married Sarah Delano. Now, if you do the math, Sarah was exactly 6 days short of being 5 months younger than her new stepson. Or as one of the park rangers said, "Go James." There's the famous picture of FDR in the dress. I'm not sure if that was the christening dress or not, with James and with Sarah. Unfortunately, because of the age disparity, James died when Franklin was only 18. Franklin attended the Groton School under the direction of Endicott Peabody, with whom he had a lifelong relationship. He attended Harvard University. He was the editor of the Harvard Crimson. He attended Columbia University and was supposed to graduate from Columbia Law School, but he dropped out. Why? He passed the bar exam before he finished his classwork. Nice guy. Then came Eleanor. Life would be upgraded. What happened? It defaulted away all the fancy script. Not that I mind.
That had nothing to do with it,
Oh, okay.
so I don't know what to.
Me neither. Okay. Eleanor was born on October 11th, 1884, at this site on West 37th Street in Manhattan. She was the daughter of Elliot Roosevelt and Anne Hall. Okay, say it. She was the daughter of Annie Hall. Yeah. Both parents died early in her life. Elliot died from a seizure after a failed suicide attempt, and Anne died of diphtheria. While Eleanor had the Roosevelt family name, the Roosevelt family fame on her side of the family was Teddy. Cousin Carol, if you've ever been to a Washington Nationals game, I guess you know who that is. Elliot and Anne, their family, the Hall family, is buried in the family tomb in Tivoli, New York. Elliot and Teddy's parents are right here in Greenwood. Eleanor was raised by her grandmother in Manhattan and up in Germantown, just north of Tivoli. She was educated in England at the Allenswood School under the direction of a Marie Silvestre. She never completed her coursework because in 1902, she was invited back to have her social debut. It was also around 1902, on a railroad trip, that Eleanor reconnected with her fifth cousin, Franklin. He asked her to marry him, and in spite the objections from Sarah, the wedding took place on March 17, 1905, at the home of a cousin on East 76th Street. Now remember, Elliot is dead. She did not have her father to give her away at the wedding. So, unfortunately, for the decorum of the wedding, the person that was there to give the bride away was none other than the President of the United States.
Teddy.
You can imagine, oh my God, Teddy's here. Oh, we're at this Ellen Franklin's wedding. No, I want to see Teddy. Oh my goodness. The wedding took place on March 17th, 1905. They moved into a place that was rented by Sarah, and then Sarah purchased this place on East 65th Street. Does anybody recognize this building now?
Yes,
Well, go ahead.
it's called Roosevelt House.
Who owns it?
Hunter
Hunter Collins. Oh, yeah, you would know.
I've been to functions in that.
Hey, there you go. 2 doors? You betcha. Sarah lived on the other side. The marriage produced 6 births: Anna, Franklin Jr., John, James, Elliot, and unfortunately, the first Franklin Jr. passed away in infancy in 1909. Sarah, being the dominating person that she was, took over the raising of the children. Son James remembered Sarah once saying, "Your mother only bore you." Eleanor, who was said never liked sex, once told her daughter Anna, sex was only an ordeal to be observed. In 1913, during the presidential administration of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin was nominated and approved to be the Undersecretary of the Navy. Okay, we all know what's coming now. That year, Eleanor, finding herself busier than ever as being the wife of a cabinet member, found it necessary to hire a social secretary. That social secretary was named Lucy Mercer. In September of 1918, Eleanor received a call saying that FDR was coming home from Europe with a case of pneumonia. They went back, telephone. They went back to the East 65th Street home where, while unpacking the bags, Eleanor found a pile of love letters from Lucy. We all know that story. Franklin offered Eleanor a divorce, but Sarah said, if you do that, I will disinherit you. So instead of the divorce, Eleanor and Franklin developed what most historians now say was one of the greatest partnerships in history. In 1920, Franklin was nominated for the vice presidency. Unfortunately, they lost to the ticket of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, but what a coincidence. That election produced a president who passed away during his term of office and had to be succeeded by the vice president. Somebody jot this down. This is our first coincidence for the day. Coolidge and Harding. Unfortunately, politics had to take a backseat to a devastating event known as polio. On August 11th, 1921, not long after a visit to a Boy Scout camp up at Bear Mountain, while on a family trip to Campobello, after days of vigorous activity, Franklin came down with chills and aches. Franklin complained that his legs were weak, and the next day he could not stand. After several days and a horrific misdiagnosis, it was finally determined that Franklin had polio. But Franklin refused to give in. He knew that being a cripple would ruin his chances for a political career. He developed huge arms and chest muscles. He learned to walk, nice picture. He learned, excuse me, he learned how to walk in a very unique way with braces, a cane, and how to hold on to somebody while he was trying to walk. I did have a question. Oh, yeah. We said that Franklin developed the huge arms and chest muscles. What was his biggest fear in life, you think?
Fire.
Fire. Absolutely. Oh, you took the tour too, huh? Anyway, the big house had to be refitted for a polio victim. A dumbwaiter elevator was installed. An extra railing was installed on the last couple of steps leading up to the living quarters. That's a really nice picture. He designed his own wheelchairs out of a couple of kitchen chairs. He exhausted himself trying to learn how to walk from the mansion to Route 9. He even devised a method of driving with hand controls for the car. One of the things that Franklin did in search of a cure was the researching the use of hydrotherapy. In doing so, he was interested in this place in a rural part of Georgia known as Warm Springs. 1 year later, he established the Warm Springs Foundation. It was here that Franklin could unwind. He didn't care who saw him, in what condition, because he was with other people with polio. He had no problem swimming in pools. He had no problem of showing his braces in public. In the meantime, Eleanor was about to get the only home she ever owned. She wished for a place where she and her political friends could go after the big house. The big house is how Hyde Park, Springwood was the actual name of the mansion, but we all call it Hyde Park. Hey, did you go to Hyde Park? If you said to somebody, are you going to Springwood? Would anybody know what you were talking about? No. But it was known as the big house, and that's how we're going to discuss it today. She was looking for a place with her political friends where she could go after the big house shut down for the winter. FDR offered her a plot of land about 2 miles away, which was part of the Roosevelt estate, and encouraged her in the building of a cottage and a factory where she and her friends, Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook, could create an industry. Anybody remember what the industry was? Or what they produced?
Making cabinets.
Yes, furniture.
Furniture.
Valkill Industries. So if you go to Valkill now, the factory was what became Eleanor's house. This was the original cottage here. Picnics were a natural occurrence, and you can sit at that very place now. FDR availed himself of the use of the pools, and you can go to that place now. In 1928, FDR was asked to nominate for the presidency New York Governor Alfred E. Smith. At that same time, FDR was placed in nomination for governor of New York, and he won that election. Fearing that Eleanor, as the wife of a governor now, would be driving around alone, FDR assigned one of his bodyguards, New York State Trooper Earl Miller, to ensure Eleanor's safety. Miller taught her how to horseback ride, how to shoot a pistol. It was said that Earl was the person that brought Eleanor out of her shell. Of course, there were always rumors about how close Eleanor and Earl were. So be it. In 1930, FDR was elected for his second term as New York governor. In those days, the governorship was only 2 years. And in November 1932, in spite of all of the difficulties, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected 32nd President of the United States. Excuse me. Once again, the big house had to be outfitted, but he almost never made it to his own inauguration. Bayfront Park, February 15, 1933. At a rally that night, gunshots rang out. FDR was fine, but Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was wounded, and he died several days later, 15 days later. A plaque commemorates the spot of the shooting, and at the Hyde Park Museum in the Presidential Library is one of the bullets. So once again, now I said the big house had to be refitted again, but this time for a president. A direct line to the White House was installed. Yes, Robert?
I think Cermak's last words were to Roosevelt, better me than you.
Yeah, something to that effect. I'm glad it was me, not you. Absolutely. We'll never know. It makes for a great story, though. Yeah, yes, that is absolutely correct. One of the things that FDR now arranged with the press is that they would never show him walking, getting out of the car. But of course, we know that some photos slipped through. This was at a baseball game in Washington, D.C. That's actually a movie. You can actually see the Roosevelt walk. And it was quite amazing, actually. This one getting off of a train, and this was the bad one, getting out of the car. What happened was FDR, we saw the picture before of the braces. FDR was in a seating position. He swiveled himself around, kicked out his legs. The Secret Service locked the braces in place. As you can see, the feet are straight out. He stood up, the cane, the body, somebody, and that's how he walked. After the election, FDR started the construction of a house down in his beloved Warm Springs, and that house was then going to become known as the Little White House. In 1934 and again in 1937, FDR traveled to the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, and the locals actually built a wheelchair for him, which is on display now. With the help of his old law partner, Basil O'Connor, FDR formed what is the organization?
March of Dimes.
The March of Dimes, for the creation of funds to create research. Well, boy, slow down. We are on a bit of a time schedule, but to create funds for the research for a cure for polio. In 1938, FDR, along with his cousin Daisy, developed the plans for a house where he could retire. Daisy was also famous as the person who gave him Fowler. Who was Fowler?
Oh, dog.
They began creating the designs for his retirement house, a place where no physical barriers were there for his wheelchair. It is a place where they could escape the mob and where they could both spend the time after his presidency. The place was called Top Cottage, and it was completed in 1939. It was a simple design, one bathroom, no phones. FDR never spent the night there. Some say it was a promise that he made to his mother. But it was there on June 11th, 1939, that FDR had the absolute nerve to do what? It was a meal to serve the King and Queen of England a hot dog. It was said that the king asked for seconds. Ron, just an aside, it was said that it was either Swift's Premium or Neatix, but it wasn't Nathan's. I don't think Nathan's in 1939 did take out. I don't know. The hot dogs were purchased by Harry Johansson. He was the son of the cook at Warm Springs. And speaking of food, FDR once commented about the food at the White House. It would do the automat good. The food was so bad. He was always teasing his cook by the name of Henrietta Nesbitt. He once said to somebody, "I want to run for a 4th term so I can fire Mrs. Nesbitt." So why didn't he fire? FDR was very, very loyal to his Hyde Park people. And, you know, the bantering went back and forth. And of course, Henrietta never, ever got fired. But it was also a top cottage at this place that one of several photos of FDR that got through sitting in his wheelchair was taken. All right, President of the United States. So who's this person over here? President of the United States. There's a Secret Service agent standing there. Also, photo of him in the wheelchair was taken at this very spot at the big house. 2 pictures of him on ships. And in front of the little White House in Warm Springs is a picture of him with the wheelchair in the background. On December 8th, 1941, Sarah Roosevelt died. I'm sorry, wrong date. In 1941, in October, Sarah Roosevelt died. November 8th, 1941, FDR went to Congress to make a declaration of war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. December. What did I just say?
You said November.
I apologize. There you go. And it says December right there. I was running ahead in my mind because I want to ask everybody, this is something else. Please write this down. FDR speech, Pearl Harbor speech, because this is going to come into play later. During the war, Eleanor became his eyes, ears, and legs to the events of the world. In March of 1944, Eleanor's most trusted assistant, and some say his gatekeeper, by the name of Missy Lahan, suffered a debilitating stroke, but FDR promised to pay her medical bills. But speaking of medical, on March 27th, 1944, FDR went to what was then known as the Bethesda Naval Hospital for a medical checkup by a cardiologist named Howard Gruen. The results were horrifying. FDR had severe hypertension, hardening of the arteries, and a low sugar level. Thus began one of the greatest cover-ups of presidential health in American history. What others do we know? Kennedy, yeah. Addison's disease, the back problems, right? Phyllis?
Didn't they also cover up his wheelchair for the most part?
Well, that was the point of the pictures before that. And if you saw that, some of those pictures got through though.
Yeah.
Reagan, how injured he really was, that the bullet just came this close to the lung. That's right.
Wasn't it Wilson or one of them that his wife had to take over after a stroke?
Woodrow Wilson, and that will play into here later. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke while he was president. Grover Cleveland had half of his upper mouth removed. It was a secret surgery that took place on a ship out on the East River. Okay, so we got it, you know. Gruen was then appointed.
Eisenhower had 7 heart attacks, but it was known because it was always on the news saying he was rushed to Walter Reed Hospital. Everybody knew that a lot of those veterans, they all smoked and drank through the Second World War, and they ended up with heart disease. But this was known.
Yeah.
So when they announced it, these were covered. That's the difference.
I think most people only knew about 2 of them. Two of the major heart attacks.
Yeah, but they knew he had a serious heart disease.
Oh, yeah.
And they knew his age and they knew his background. This is not the same thing.
No.
Because this was really covered up.
Right. Right. Ross McIntyre appointed, Dr. Bruin as FDR's personal physician, so of course the press was now all abuzz. Why does FDR have a cardiologist following him around? In 1944, excuse me, in 1944, Missy Lahan finally passed away. In the fall of 1944, FDR was nominated for a fourth term as president. His opponent was Republican Tom Dewey. Tom Dewey, as we remember from, well, at least from one of my talks, the old nemesis of the mafia. On October 21st, FDR embarked on a 5-borough tour during a day-long rainstorm. The first stop was Ebbets Field, and if you notice the ramp, that was where he gave his speech. He gave his speech from his car. He finished up the day-long tour at Eleanor's Greenwich Village apartment, the first time he had ever been there. He made it through, but he looked like hell. And then finally, on a bitter cold afternoon of January 20th, 1945, FDR was sworn in for his fourth term as president. The inauguration took place at the White House, not at the Capitol. And it was the shortest inauguration speech in history. Excuse me. In the background, far from the sight of everybody in the crowd, was the recently widowed Lucy Mercer. In February of 1945, FDR was on board the USS Quincy on his way home from the Yalta Conference. Many people in Yalta felt they would never see him again. It was not a quiet trip home because his top military aide, Edwin Watson, died on the trip home. FDR attended the funeral at Arlington. He watched the burial from the car. Quick, and I'm glad Lori is here. Sorry, Lori, Lori in person. I am glad Lori Pandolfo is here. This grave, the Medal of Honor grave, behind Paul Watson, belongs to a guy by the name of Daniel Sickles. Some people call Danny Sickles the hero of Gettysburg. Most people know that he's a Bissell Meshuggah. And his family is buried here. He's in Arlington, but his family is buried here in Greenwood. Please, once again, somebody write that down, Dan Sickles, and if we have time at the end, I'll go through it again. On March 1st, FDR made a speech to Congress about the results of the Yalta Conference, but there was one very, very big difference. What was it?
He delivered this speech seated.
That's correct. He was wheeled into the House chamber, but instead of giving the speech standing up, he was wheeled behind a bank of microphones. I hope you will pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I wish to say, but I know you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me of not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel on the bottom of my legs, and also because I have completed a 14,000-mile trip. For the first time, FDR publicly referred to his disability. Many of Congress felt that they would never see him again. On March 17, 1945, Eleanor and Franklin celebrated their 40th anniversary, and then it was off to Hyde Park, but he got no rest there. His blood pressure was high, and he was having gastrointestinal distress. His hands shook so much he had trouble shaving himself and buttoning his shirt. He actually asked Eleanor to perform the sacred task of mixing the pre-dinner cocktails. So it was decided that there would be one more trip to Warm Springs. And on March 29th, the presidential motorcade pulled up to the secret railroad siding at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing for the trip south. The train was known as POTUS, but you know that back then that was a unique acronym. We all know what that stands for now. President of the United States, we have POTUS, we have SCOTUS now, we have all kinds of us's now. The train was ready to go. As usual, FDR would ride in the fully armored Pullman car known as the Ferdinand Magellan. Going with him would be Cousin Daisy, the person that gave him Fala, and the person that helped him design Top Cottage. Also going on the trip would be acid-tongued Polly Delano. Remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Sarah's maiden name was Delano, so she was on Sarah's side of the family. Also going on the trip would be his secretary, Grace Tully, press secretary, Bill Hassett, And the public would know if anything happened of great importance down there from the writing of the 3 pool reporters that were going with him. Merriman Smith from the United Press International, Harold Oliver from the Associated Press, and Robert Nixon from the International News Service. Go ahead.
One little fact.
Yeah.
I work for UPI. And Merriman Smith went on after that, become the chief White House correspondent. And at the end of every presidential news conference, you say, thank you, Mr. President. That was Merriman Smith.
That was his job. Merriman Smith was also in the motorcade when Kennedy was shot.
Well, I happen to know from the inside what happened. The AP guy and Merriman Smith got to a fist fight.
Yeah, but on the phone, who would use the phone?
Going first. And he was very well thought of. He, nothing like Alan Thompson. He was really a dean of White House correspondence at the time.
And with his military background, he's actually buried in Arlington. And of course, there would be no doubt who else would be going. What do you think? The dog. Val. The next day, when the train arrived at Warm Springs, the onlookers were shocked. The president was thin, gray, and not his usual animated self. He did not wave to the crowd. Chief Secret Service agent Mike Riley was totally taken aback when he had to do all the lifting in transferring FDR from his wheelchair to the car. Usually FDR would assist, and lean and whatever. FDR was dead weight in his hands. That night, Bill Hassett said to Dr. Bruin, "He is slipping away from us, and no earthly power can keep him here." Dr. Bruin finally realized that the cover-up over FDR's health is no longer going to work. On FDR, okay. On April 3rd, FDR was well enough to host the president of the Philippines. On April 9th, word came that an artist, Elizabeth Shumatov, would be arriving in Warm Springs to do a watercolor. She had done one previously in 1943, but was asked by a friend to accompany her to do another one. Look familiar? 2 days before her arrival in Georgia, on her way down from her home in Locust Valley, New York, Shumatov stopped in South Carolina to pick up that friend. Anybody?
Lucy Mercer Rutherford.
That friend was Lucy Mercer. You see, Franklin and Lucy had never really lost touch. In 1944, Lucy's husband, Winthrop Rutherford, died. 1 month later, while visiting Bernard Baruch at his home in South Carolina, FDR made a side trip to Lucy's home in Aiken. And in 1944, on a trip to Hyde Park, FDR had the train diverted to Lucy's other home in Alamunchee, New York. It was said that being with Lucy did more for FDR than any heart medicine could ever have done. Along with Lucy and Elizabeth Shumatov was Elizabeth's photographer, Nicholas Robbins. Robbins was asked to do 2 portraits of FDR. Would anybody believe that was Franklin Roosevelt? That was how he looked the day before he died. It was also asked that Nicholas do a portrait of Lucy. That night, FDR sat for a few preliminary sketches, and then he was working on his speech for April 25th that he was going to deliver in San Francisco to the opening of the United Nations. That night, FDR hosted Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. On the morning of April 12th, 1945, FDR's 4,422nd day as president, Harry Truman's 82nd day as vice president. FDR slept late, but there was no rush to get up. The government pouch, as it was called, or the laundry bag, as it was called, the government mail bag, was going to be late, so he slept in. He told Lizzie McDuff, the housemaid at Warm Springs, that he had a pain in the back of his head, but nothing was made out of it. Secretary Grace Tully, Chief Agent Mike Riley, and Dr. Howard Bruin actually all went down to the swimming pools to have a swim that morning. At FDR, at 11 o'clock that morning, FDR was given a bath, by his valet, Arthur Prettyman. And he actually mentioned to Arthur, you know, I'm gonna buy a sheet of stamps for my collection. This was the president of the United States, but that's how, you know, his stamp collection, if you know anything about FDR, that was his pride and joy. Other than his ship models, that was his pride and joy. So once the laundry bag arrived, maybe at this table, and maybe at a position sitting like this, FDR went to work. At one point, after signing one of the pieces, oh, by the way, it was called the laundry bag. Anybody know why? When you sign something, remember, we didn't have ballpoint pens.
There was a card in it.
Right?
Have to hang it up to dry.
That's right. Absolutely correct. Thank you, Bob. And after signing one of the papers, he looked up to the ladies and said, "This is how I make the law." Because we know Congress makes laws, but you know, he's showing off to the ladies. Joe Esperantia was setting the table for lunch. So FDR told Shumatov, "We have 15 minutes more." People in the room were pleased at the return of color to his face. Ruth, you would know this. People who were thrilled about the return of color to his face did not know that that was a preliminary of what was just about to happen. At about 1:15, Roosevelt shared a word with Lucy and saw her smile. Then, suddenly, he lifted a shaking hand to his head and said, "I have a terrific headache." Shumatov kept painting for a while, but Cousin Daisy went over, didn't hear what he said. And she said to him, "Franklin, did you drop your cigarette?" With drooping eyes and a slack jaw, FDR fell unconscious. At that point, Elizabeth Shumatov ran screaming out of the house, asked the Secret Service agent on duty outside the house, James Beery, to go get the doctor. Sentry stations were put on alert. Shumatov came back in and said to Lucy, "We have to get out of here." In the meantime, Arthur Prettyman and Joe Esperantia took the president into his bedroom and laid him out on the bed. Dr. Bruin arrived from the swimming pool and found FDR with a rapid and weak pulse and a blood pressure of a whopping 300 over 190. A call was placed back to Washington to Dr. McIntyre to tell him what happened. Dr. Bruin administered medications which brought the blood pressure down. Yes, I'm fumbling a little. Which brought the blood pressure down. But FDR's breathing was erratic and raspy. His lips were cyanotic. They were blue. It was determined that FDR had suffered a CVA, a cerebral vascular accident, a cerebral hemorrhage. FDR had a stroke. A call was put in to a cardiac specialist in Atlanta by the name of James Paulin. How fast can you get to Warm Springs? Wasn't fast enough. Elizabeth, in the meantime, told Lucy that they had to leave the cottages. A call was placed to downtown Warm Springs, and Nicholas was told, "Get your tuchas back here. We gotta leave right away." In the meantime, Eleanor receives a call from Cousin Polly saying that Franklin had fainted. Really? Ross McIntyre tells the doctor back in Washington, tells Eleanor not to cancel her appointment at the Sulgrave Club. And Eleanor arrived there and sat with Mrs. Edith Wilson. Now, we just discussed this before about Woodrow Wilson. She is now sitting at this concert with the wife of another president who just suffered a stroke while he was in office. While Dr. Bruin was attending FDR, he could not believe how much fight his patient had in him. By all rights, FDR should have been dead. At Georgia time, Dr. Paulin, excuse me, having missed all of the Secret Service agents' checkpoints because he knew the back roads how to get to Warm Springs, arrived, ran into the bedroom and injected adrenaline right into FDR's heart. Didn't work. At 3:35, excuse me, At 3:35, April 12th, 1945, FDR died. Bill Hassett called the White House and Press Secretary Steve Early to convey the news. Early tells Hassett not to say anything until 4 o'clock, Georgia time, so that Eleanor can be told and the announcement can be made both from Washington and from Warm Springs. Back in DC, Eleanor was listening to the concert when she received the call from Steve Early saying, "Get back to the White House." She told the group after a musical performance was over, "I am called back to the White House and apologize for having to leave." In the car, Eleanor recalled, and I quote, "I did not even ask why. I knew down in my heart something dreadful had happened. But no one actually formulates those terrible thoughts until they are actually spoken." Early now released the news to the 3 major news services in Washington, as does Hassett released it to the pool reporters in Warm Springs. The International News Service published what was until that time the shortest headline in history. Flash. Who remembers? Flash, FDR dead. A young CBS News reporter delivered the news on air. Is Adrian out there?
Someone's here.
Yeah, Adrian? No?
I think she may be waiting.
Okay, no problem. A young CBS News reporter delivered the news on the air. As Bennett Cerf used to say, that news reporter's name, John Charles Daly. Everybody remembers the old, what's my line? That's right. Early's next call was to Vice President Truman. Told him to leave the Capitol at once and come in the front door of the White House. Truman didn't ask why. He grabbed his hat, didn't even pick up his Secret Service guard. Boy, that was really great guarding, but he was only the vice president in those days. And left and went into the White House. This one, this is a tough one because this is one of the most famous lines in presidential history. He got back to the White House, was taken up to Eleanor, and said, and was told by Eleanor, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman says to Eleanor, "Is there anything I can do for you?"
Is there anything I can do for you, Mr. President?
What's the end of it?
You're the one in trouble now.
That's right. For those of you that didn't hear it, Eleanor just looked at Truman and said, "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." Eleanor's next task was to notify her sons. They were in the service all over the world, and she didn't know which one, if any of them, would be able to get to the funeral. Back in Georgia, Elizabeth, Nicholas, and Lucy were traveling through Macon, Georgia, when they saw a flag at half-mast. That was the sign that FDR had died. Lucy let out a scream. Truman sent for his entire cabinet and Chief Justice Harlan Fiske, and at 7:09 DC time, Harry S. Truman was officially sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. After the ceremony, it was said that Henry Stimson was the first person that told Truman about the development of a new weapon. Truman had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. Truman returned to his Connecticut Avenue home, and I remember the first time I showed this, Emily Whitehead was sitting in the audience. She says, "I know that house." You remember Kelly went to school at American University in Northern Washington. He went back to his house, no longer as Harry, but as the new president of the free world. But back in Georgia, there was business to be done. A funeral home in Atlanta was called, and a request was made for a casket that had to be at least 6'3" and made of metal, but metal was in short supply during the war. They found one weighing 600 pounds. It's basically what it was me like bringing all my stuff down the stairs. Fred Patterson arrived at the little White House, 2 caskets, 4 assistants, 1 hearse, and no partridge in a pear tree. They were told that they cannot do their work until Eleanor arrived from Fort Benning. How did Eleanor get there? Well, she now realized she wasn't the First Lady of the United States anymore, and could you imagine, in her grace, knowing she was going to have to want to be with the body of her dead husband in Georgia from Washington, she asked Harry Truman for permission to get a government plane to go to Georgia. That was Eleanor. She, along with Steve Early and Dr. Ross McIntyre, arrived at the Little White House, and she wanted to know from everybody what happened and who was there. She was in for a huge surprise. She went in to visit with Franklin for 5 minutes and came out, and it was then that Polly said, "Oh yeah, Lucy was here." Eleanor was livid. Then Polly said, "And it was your daughter Anna that arranged it." Now remember, Polly was from Sarah's side of the family, but Eleanor was not a favorite of the people in her family. Her first cousin, Alice, and we've heard stories about Alice Walker. Her first cousin, Alice, Teddy's daughter, her first cousin, once said he deserved to have a good time. He was married to Eleanor, some cousin, right? April 13th, 1945, the trip began back to Washington, D.C., which was very coincidental and was very ironic, considering FDR's well-known triskaidekaphobia. It was decided that there would be no autopsy, and the embalming began a little after midnight, April 13th. But the embalming took over 5 hours. Remember, FDR had major arterial sclerosis. They couldn't get the stuff into his body. They were absolutely aghast at how long. In the meantime, the head carpenter from the Warm Springs Rehab Center was tasked with building a ramp that would lead from street level to the train that was going to take the casket back to DC. That ramp had to withstand a 600-pound casket, a 180-pound body, and the weight of 10 soldiers that it would take to get that casket up the ramp and into the train. The flag was flying over the Little White House, and that was the one that they had to use on the casket because the funeral parlor didn't bring a flag, believe it or not. Right? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had a corner of my eye, I saw the hand go up. That's okay. As was Roosevelt's tradition, every time he left Warm Springs, he would go past the rehab center. Today would be no exception. And it was at the rehab center that the famous photo was taken of Graham Jackson playing the accordion. At the station, the casket arrived by hearse, and it took 20 soldiers to load the casket into the railroad car. An honor guard of 4 servicemen surrounded the casket. The bier that was built by the carpenter was just high enough to be seen by onlookers as the train made its way up to Washington. Eleanor entered the armored car, Ferdinand Magellan, and then slowly, without even a puff of smoke, because the train was on a downward slope, the presidential train left Warm Springs for the final time. After the train left, souvenir hunters ravaged the ramp. In Atlanta, 20,000 people showed up to see the funeral train. Mayor William Hartsfeld put a wreath next to the casket. The train passed through Aiken, where FDR had secretly stopped to see Lucy not so long ago. In Greenville, Southern Railroad engine number 1401 was hooked up to the train. That engine is now on display at the Smithsonian. During the trip, the planning of a funeral was to take place. The wording of cards was sent back from the train to the government printing office for invitations to the funeral and thanks for expressions of condolences. On the morning of April 14th, 80 years to the day, and 159 years ago, to this very day of the shooting of Abraham Lincoln, the funeral service of FDR would be held in the White House. Truman went to meet the casket at Union Station, and he was surrounded by a very strange bunch of people. With him was Henry Wallace, the man that was dropped from the presidential ticket. If he was kept on the ticket, he would have been president. In the car was also Jimmy Burns, probably one of the most knowledgeable men in Washington DC at that time, who people thought should have been vice president and thus should have been president. Also there were the big military Makis, Admiral Ernest King, Admiral William Leahy, and General George Marshall. The train backed into what is now known all the way on the right-hand side, and what is now known as track 33. They brought it into a platform that didn't have a canopy, so there would be nothing in the way for the caisson to walk up to the train and have the casket loaded onto the caisson. It was another irony that you don't have to write down because I'm going to put it up there. While I was at Union Station taking my pictures, there was actually a Pullman car sitting there. The casket was unloaded, put onto a caisson, taken up from the lower levels of Union Station, and you can stand at that point right now. Went up Delaware Avenue, up Pennsylvania Avenue, past the building we now know as the, what building is that? That's the Treasury Building, next to the White House. The body was carried inside the White House under the direction of Sergeant James Powder. The procession took 2 hours to get everybody to the White House from Union Station. But the simple service, which started at 4 o'clock and presided over by Bishop Angus Dunn from the National Cathedral, took only 23 minutes. At this point, the funeral was under the direction of the very, very, very high-end Gallers Funeral Home. They're the ones that took over the Kennedy funeral when the body got back to DC from Dallas. After the service, Eleanor took Anna up into the White House and confronted her about Lucy being in Warm Springs. Anna admitted to the conflict of violating her mother's trust, but also wanting to soothe her father's loneliness. How long it took Eleanor to ever forgive Anna, if she ever did, is under debate. Eleanor then went back to the East Room, had the casket open, put a flower and her ring, and the casket was then sealed forever. The casket was closed, and at 9 p.m. was placed into a hearse and driven back to Union Station. Shelley, nice picture. Thank you. Taken back to Union Station. The funeral train was supposed to leave at 10 o'clock, but a coupling broke. They started to pull out again, and the coupler broke again. In the meantime, Harry Truman was not in the armored car, Ferdinand Magellan. Instead, he was in his own car. Could you imagine the President of the United States during wartime giving up an armored railroad car or an armored anything? And that's how he traveled to Hyde Park. The train was hooked up to one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's powerful GG1 engines, just like this one. And then finally, after 2 attempts, a little after 11 p.m., the funeral train carrying the body of FDR was making its way up to Hyde Park. The first stop would have been New York City, Penn Station. Secret Service agent Mike Riley and a whole troop of agents did not take the train. They flew to Stewart Air Force Base. Yeah. They needed to get a head start to secure the Big House land for the funeral. April 15th, 1945, to Hyde Park and the burial. Just after midnight, the train arrived in Baltimore. The next major station was Wilmington. The next major station was Philadelphia 30th Street Station, where 50,000 people showed up to see the train. You're all nodding. You know that story. They weren't allowed down there. They were told the only place to see the train. Now, I can't believe this. Obviously, there were plenty of places. You know the route past the zoo and everything. For those of you that don't know who I'm talking to, Ruth DeLay is originally from Philadelphia. They were, no, can't see the train. A little after 4 a.m., the funeral train, oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to say, the entire U.S. government was making this trip. There were 2 trains. the funeral train, and a train that was called the Congressional. Gee, what an original name. I don't know. Anyway, at a little after 4, the train went through the Meadowlands, through the Bergen Portal. By the way, those people that hear the stories about this new tunnel under the Hudson because it was damaged by Hurricane Sandy, that's the tunnel that they were talking about, that was damaged during Sandy. And they pulled into Penn Station. But, just like in Philadelphia, people were not allowed to see the train. The only place they would have been able to see the train in Manhattan, the only place, would have been the open cut between 9th and 10th Avenues behind Penn Station. And even then, they probably would have had to have climbed on ladders to look down. But if the funeral had taken place this year, 2024, they would not have seen it at all, because now that even the open cut is now covered by the construction of the building. They arrived at track 11 and track 12. At 5:03, the trains made their way out, pulled by an electric engine of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, through the East River Tunnel, up through the Sunnyside Yards, over the Hellgate Bridge, but not to Hyde Park. As we all know, up until recently, there was no direct connection that connected the old Pennsylvania Railroad, Amtrak, to the old New York Central Railroad, Metro North. The train had to go all the way east to New Rochelle, almost Connecticut, not quite. The train would have come in on your left, coming at you, because I'm facing south. The train would have come at you and then switched onto the tracks that would have gone back south to the right, down on what was then the New York Central line. In New Rochelle, the Pennsylvania and New York Central met to then go up the Hudson. And that would be what we now call the New Haven-Hartford line, I believe. The train came back from New Rochelle to Mott Haven in the Bronx, where the trains were swapped out for the electric engines to steam locomotives for the final trip to Hyde Park. But that takes time. Could you imagine in the South Bronx, in this open pit, was the entire US government for almost an hour? Needless to say, NYPD, the military, the Secret Service, they were not happy campers. For those of you that can't picture it, okay, there's one more, there are a couple of photos before that. Finally, as they called it, the deadhead, the pilot engine pulled out. The pilot engine's job was to make sure the tracks were clear from the South Bronx all the way up to Hyde Park. Then the Congressional pulled out, and then finally the funeral train pulled out. 2 hours after it left Penn Station. For those of you that really can't picture it, it's on the screen. For those of you here in person, the train, did I use the same colors? Yeah. The train on the orange came in through Penn Station and had to go all the way up to New Rochelle to get on to what we now call Metro North, back to the Bronx, to then go all the way up to Hyde Park. And you know what? In those days, that was normal. After the train started making its way up the Hudson, it passed the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and in the city of Garrison, a whole bunch of friars from a place that was called, I'll get the name of it, the Glencliff Monastery, which is now known as the Garrison Institute, stood silently as if they themselves were West Point cadets. And that's the monastery now. Then they went through the city of Cold Spring. I want to make a quick diversion. Ron, you should stop smiling now. You did this marvelous, marvelous talk about the Roeblinks. They're buried at Cold Spring. After Cold Spring, right outside of Cold Spring, was this little turn in the tracks by this mountainside, and it was at this place, although the photographer was a lot stupider, or I was a lot smarter than the photographer, I did not go on the other side of the tracks. but this is where the only picture was taken of the entire funeral train. And this is the back of the train. The casket was in the rear car, the armored Ferdinand Magellan, and then Truman's car. Once they got past, they were heading towards Beacon with the Poughkeepsie bridges in the background. Once the funeral train reached Poughkeepsie, they knew that the Congressional, which was traveling ahead of them, had already reached the Hyde Park station. It took over 200 automobiles to unload everybody and take them to the mansion for the burial, and even that wasn't enough. Many of the cars had to make a return trip. It was said that Harry Truman had to take a taxi. I guess they didn't take the presidential limo on the train like they do now. In the meantime, the presidential train arrived for the final time at the little siding at the base of the mansion at the riverside for the trip up to the burial site. Halfway up the hill, the body was transferred from a hearse to a caisson. The caisson was accompanied by a flock of West Point cadets. The cadets were under the direction of George Honan. That morning at 3 a.m., the cadets were awakened, given their instructions, and then taken across the Mid-Hudson Bridge in the dark on the buses. The trucks carried the horses and the caisson for the procession. They were under the direction of A.J. McGehee with only 1 day to plan a burial. The body was taken up past the back of the mansion, and you can walk on these paths now, up the hill to street level, and again, you can be on that exact place, to the front of the Rose Garden where FDR had made his wish that he wanted to be buried. At the funeral were cousins Daisy and cousin Polly and Fowler. The casket was brought into the Rose Garden. The service was under the direction, is that for us? No. The service was under the direction of Reverend George Anthony from the St. James Church, to which Franklin was a member. The service only took 17 minutes. With each volley of the 21-gun salute, Fowler marked. And the place looks the same now. Taps were played by U.S. Army Sergeant Newell Fisher. Eleanor then went into the house to get changed. This is it. This is what you see now. Eleanor went upstairs to get changed, and then she was going to take the train back to DC. Well, what did that mean? The train had to wait for Eleanor. Harry Truman, President of the United States, could not go back to Washington until Eleanor got to the train. Finally, Eleanor came back. I'm pretty sure from my talk on Truman, I think that's one of Truman's bodyguards. I'm not quite sure. Ooh, nice picture. Finally, Truman got back, the train made its way, and lunch was served. A whole bunch of people decided not to go on the train. James Forrestal and Edward Stettinius, here are some names if you know your history, decided to drive back to Hackensack and then fly back to DC. Truman said to Eleanor, you can stay in the White House as often as you want, but of course, Eleanor didn't want nothing to do with that. Truman said, you can stay as long as you want, I will go to the Blair House. Oh, if he only knew what that statement meant. Write that down, Blair House. Somebody write that down. In the meantime, 4 o'clock in the afternoon at Floyd Bennett Field, James Roosevelt arrived. He was stuck in Nebraska, bad weather. He could not make it to New York for the funeral. He met the train as it came back on its way to DC, and Eleanor handed him an envelope. In the envelope, because Eleanor wouldn't open it, because the envelope said James on it. Eleanor had asked Grace Tully, do you know of any funeral plans? And Grace knew about some, but she couldn't remember. Why? Because in that envelope was a document that was written in the late 1930s. of FDR's funeral plans. Well, it's too late to do anything about it now, but to realize with Tully's memory and everybody knowing what FDR liked and didn't like, they pretty much got it right. Eleanor moved back to her apartment in Greenwich Village and said to her bunch of reporters, the story. Sorry, anybody know? You don't remember that?
Story is ended.
Yeah, exactly. Bob, you're good. The story is over. What FDR never told Truman? On the way back to Washington, Truman was finally told about the research. Excuse me, about the research that was going on in Oak Ridge, Hannaford, and of course, at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves. Leslie Groves was the person responsible a couple of years before that for the building of the Pentagon. At this spot of land, about 25 miles in July of 1945, at a place called Trinity, the atomic bomb was tested. Truman then gave a warning to the Japanese, a rain of ruin from the sky will hit you. The Japanese not capitulating, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima from the bomber Enola Gay. 3 days later, from the bomber Boxcar, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The war was over. Former surrender, September 2nd, 1945. In 1948, Lucy Mercer passed away. In spite of what Eleanor said to the reporters, the story was not over. She became a prolific author. Truman asked her to become the representative to the first meeting of the United Nations. Eleanor's the tall green one, in case anybody couldn't tell. Eleanor spent many, many happy days with Fallon, quite unexpectedly. Who asked if, somebody asked me about Fallon's grave. Okay, don't be bashful. Until Fallon died in 1952. 10 years to the day after FDR's death at the University of Michigan, it was announced by Thomas Francis that the Salk vaccine, the polio vaccine, was successful. 10 years to the day. Eleanor spent her final days with her doctor friend, David Goreyevich, even after Goreyevich married somebody closer to his age. Just running ahead here.
Carla?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I read a book about Lorena Hickok's
Right.
relationship
Right.
with Eleanor.
Right.
Did that continue?
They had a falling out. They did have a major falling out. And just hold that question for about 10 minutes, because that's going to be at the very end. Go ahead.
Alan, just one more point. 'Cause
Yeah.
You may not return to polio, but I just
Go
want
ahead.
to note that we now know that, that polio patients have an increased risk of stroke.
Mhm.
The study I saw about 4 times.
Oh, wow.
the population.
Okay.
And hypoxia, that cardiovascular disease in general, which might be compounded by not being able to exercise.
Yeah.
But just, yeah.
Yeah.
And post-polio syndrome and smoking.
Well, if you remember the pictures of FDR, back in the, and I was really trying to rush, so I didn't want to nitpick. If you remember the pictures where we highlighted FDR's major building up of his upper body, his legs were like this. He was totally atrophied. Totally. Yeah. So, back about the, about polio. Anyway, she shared a brownstone on East 74th with David. She became a must-visit for any aspiring politician, and they listened to what she had to say, to what Eleanor had to tell them. Unfortunately, suffering from the onset of bone marrow tuberculosis, Eleanor Roosevelt, excuse me, Eleanor Roosevelt died on November 7th, 1962, but her funeral was far from quiet. The service was held at St. James at Hyde Park, and again, you can go there. The service was held at St. James in Hyde Park, where FDR had been a chief warden of the church. This service was attended by 3 presidents and 1 future president. No, she did not disappear from public life. Here is a picture of Kennedy arriving at the funeral. Oh, by the way, this agent here, for those of you that are Kennedy assassination nuts, this is the guy that was in the front seat of the car, in the passenger seat when Kennedy was shot. You could be in that spot right now. The funeral for Eleanor took place, and by Franklin's instructions, she was buried in the spot in the Rose Garden next to Franklin, as per his wish. They were together again. Eleanor now is the subject of one of the 2024 quarters in the quarter series. Gail? In 1988, Lorena Hickok died. She was the reporter for the Associated Press that encouraged Eleanor to start writing her My Day column. The two became so close. This would never happen today. The two became so close that Lorena felt it necessary to resign her position as a reporter. It is no secret that Lorena had a room in the White House. Harry Truman died in 1972. He and Bess are buried at the Truman Library in Independence. FDR's legacy does live on in the large number of monuments erected in his name. The unfinished portrait resides at the Little White House in Warm Springs. You can go there. FDR himself only wanted a small block placed behind the National Archives that was dedicated in 1965, 20 years after his death. Here in Brooklyn, we have FDR High School, just forget the police car. Here in Brooklyn at Brooklyn College, we have Roosevelt Hall. Cousin Lori, there are the giant presidential heads in Houston, Texas. There is another large bust here in New York at 4 Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island. In 1997, the FDR National Memorial was dedicated, but not without controversy. He is depicted without his glasses, without his cigarette, and if you look at it, without even any mention of the wheelchair. But go behind, and there are the wheels. But no matter what the controversy, at least there was power. Other monuments around the world were not as shy about showing FDR's disability. This statue of Roosevelt and Churchill on Bond Street, take a look at the feet. There are the braces.
Hi, Alan. I walked by that 3 days ago.
Really? Who was that?
Yes, Eslin.
Hi.
Yeah, I walked by when I was in Westminster. I walked there to go to Oxford Street, and I passed it.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, 3 days ago.
I'm glad to know it's still there, because you can see it was taken in 1999. Oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you so much. Back at the FDR National Memorial, if anybody has been there, the memorial is laid out in different sections, or as they call it, different rooms. And in each room is a famous quote from that era that the room is depicting, whether it was the funeral, whether it was World War II, whether it was the Great Depression, or his early life. And FDR was quoted saying, "I hate war. I've seen war. I hate war." But in the World War II room, you would think that there would be yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The United States was attacked by the air and naval forces of the Imperial Empire of Japan. Not a sign, nothing. As one of the park rangers said to me when I asked, how come? They said, well, maybe the sculptor didn't want to offend the present-day Japanese. I have no idea. This was one person's opinion, but it's not there. But in 2001, finally, a wheelchair depiction was added. And for all of us that thought we knew the Roosevelts, in 2014, Ken Burns gave us a real education. Many questions still remain about FDR's health. Did he have a standing heart attack when he gave a speech in 1944 at the U.S. Naval Base in Bremerton? Was the spot over his eye really a malignant melanoma? Remember, we'll never know. There was no autopsy.
Excuse me,
Eleanor
Alan?
was not worried about how to pay for the mansion, how to pay her taxes. She arranged to have the big house donated to the federal government. 1 year to the day, Springwood opened to the public, as are the other places now. Cousin Polly's house in Rhinebeck, known as Wilderstein, is open for tours. I was fortunate enough to be at the big house on the 35th anniversary of FDR's death, and his son John was there. In January of 1982, a major fire erupted at the mansion, but repairs were made, and it is now open for tours. Eleanor's own home, Valkill, was opened to the public in 1984, and completing the triangle, Top Cottage, which had been a private residence after FDR's death, was open to the public in 2001. These are now all part of the FDR National Historic Site, which also includes the Henry Wallace Visitor Center, the Presidential Library and Museum, the first such institution to be dedicated while the president was in office. Gee, another nice picture. Things have looked different, must have been different in 1940, but it's hard to imagine nowadays that the home of a sitting wartime president was this visible from the highway. But whatever you may think of this amazingly historic family, if you go to Hyde Park, Eleanor and Franklin will be there, and they'll be happy to talk to you.
Excuse me, Alan? It's Aline.
Working on that last slide for the last 2 months, and I knew I wasn't gonna get through it. Again, I've been up there for about 15, maybe 20 times, and I've been fortunate enough to take several people in this room up there with me. And I've had wonderful times up there, so I'm sorry, I get a little emotional. All right, we're open to questions. Before we take the questions, 1, 2, 3, Ron, you had your hand up? And Phyllis. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention. The thing about, go ahead, Mike.
No, you could do.
Okay, let me get out of your way. The thing I mentioned about Dan Sickles. Dan Sickles was a US congressman, and he was married to a young lady who was having an affair with the son of Francis Scott Key. And after he found out about it, he confronted Philip Key and killed him, and he was the first person acquitted on the insanity defense. He lost his leg in the Battle of Gettysburg, and every so often he would go back and visit his fractured leg bone at the US Army Museum. So that was that. Okay, questions here, Gail.
It's more comment. Bob and I are very interested in warm water aquatic therapy and polio as a recreation therapist. We have visited the Roosevelt Warm Springs Rehabilitation Center down in Warm Springs, Georgia. It is an operating rehabilitation center to this day with a model, fully accessible outdoor recreation camp. FDR was very big on recreation, horseback riding, fishing, everything is wheelchair accessible. We've swum in the pools. They have indoor pools where they pipe in the water from the actual warm springs. And there is warm water aquatic therapy going on today for people with Parkinson's disease, people with spinal cord injury, people with stroke. They have a big program for people with developmental disabilities. So Roosevelt Warm Springs Rehab Center was part of his vision. This was part of his vision to create a healing environment for people with disabilities.
This year, my conference that was in California last year, this year, my conference is in Atlanta, and I will be taking some of my conference buddies back to Warm Springs. Also, hopefully I'll find some of the graves of, some of those people that I didn't know were even there the last time I was down there. You saw that the pictures were 1990 and 2011, so I want to upgrade them now digitally, like that, whatever it's called. Ron?
That last slide you have, where you're sitting with Eleanor and Frank.
Yeah.
Can you speak to them, and did they respond?
Franklin, be nice to our guests. Babs, I am nice. Robert?
I'm still unclear. How was Franklin, I'm not sorry, how was Eleanor related to Teddy? Second cousin?
No, niece.
She was a niece?
Her father was Teddy's brother.
Oh, so she was more than just a cousin.
She was fifth cousin to Franklin.
But she was, Franklin was not related to Teddy, so.
Very, very far.
Until he married Eleanor.
That would have been closer than he really was.
Right.
I mean, the way that they explain it in Sagamore Hill,
Yeah.
they say that the Westchester direction was where the Franklin Roosevelts were, the Teddy Roosevelts.
Right.
So it's sort of orthogonal.
So if somebody else was Franklin related to Teddy, not really.
There were the Hyde Park Roosevelts and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. And that's as far as we're gonna go. Phyllis?
So I'm just curious why they didn't have him lie in state.
Why they,
He didn't lie in state.
he didn't want it.
He didn't want it.
He didn't want it. He wanted the simple funeral. The amazing thing was the funeral service took 20 minutes. That was, somebody else?
There's two people on Zoom, Eslin and Queen.
Eslin, please.
Hi, hello. It's amazing that you put that. I was so shocked. I took a picture, but oh God, I'd have to find it. But I passed it and I said, oh my goodness, I never knew this was here. I was going down Bond Street to get on Oxford Street, going from Westminster, from Buckingham Palace, walking through, and I saw it. I said, this is a nice place, and people were taking pictures. So it's amazing that you're talking about that. And the second thing is, where is the train now that he used for his funeral? And my other question, then I get off, was his funeral planned the way he wanted it to go? I know you just said it was he wanted something simple, but was this something he detailed, like Queen Elizabeth had what's called Operation London Bridge, which she was planning over a period of time, and if this should happen, then this should be here. But hers was detailed by her what should happen upon her death. Was that the same with this guy? And I'm done.
Franklin's funeral. Everything okay? Franklin's funeral, again, he had dictated the stuff with Grace Tully, his secretary. So basically they had to go from that memory but it was, if I have the dates right, 6 or 7 years before the death.
Okay.
And so if you read through the document, like I said, they pretty much got it right. No lying in state, the simple, well, the headstone could have been done at any time. That was not necessarily that day, but the lying in state. To answer your question, as I said, the locomotive 1401 is at the Smithsonian. The Roald Amundsen, after carrying the Truman Party on the funeral train, returned to the Pullman Fleet, where it served until 1948. That Truman's car, as you saw in the picture, is still on display. It's in Arizona. The Magellan is in Miami. The Cognac, which is the railroad car that the casket was in, was scrapped I just lost it.
Oh, okay.
It was heavily damaged in a flood in 1972, and it was scrapped. And those are really the only ones that I talked about. Where am I? Okay, while I'm on, the major source, there it is, was a book called, come back here, Owl, was a major book called FDR's Funeral Train.
Yeah, funeral train, okay. I was you. I could hear you, but there were times when I couldn't hear you. It was sort of in and out, so I may have missed some things that you said. But
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
You got a chance now. Helene?
Yes, it's me. I'm here. To begin with, I was only 4.5 years old when he passed away, but I heard all the stories from my family, good and bad. I'm going to relate a conversation that I had with Isaac Safati Friday night after services. Based on your lecture, he was talking about his experiences during World War II. And he said that he and his family hid in the Greek mountains until the war was over and he could come back to Saloniki. And he said he was standing on a balcony and he saw a flag at half staff. And that's when he was told that FDR died.
Wow.
That,
Yeah.
that is what I wanted to say. I found that firsthand information and wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I was hoping people would do that. I only see Helene's hand. Anybody else?
I don't think we have any other.
Okay, any questions in the room? The coincidences, remember we talked about FDR being nominated for vice president and he lost to Coolidge and Harding. Calvin Coolidge died in 1923 while in office. If those people were, did I say Calvin Coolidge? Yes. Calvin Coolidge succeeded Warren Harding. I was going ahead of myself because I wanted to talk about the 20-year jinx. From 1840 to 1960, every president elected in the year ending in a zero did not finish their term of office. When Reagan was shot in 1981, the immediate thing in my mind was the jinx continues, but he broke the jinx. He broke the jinx. Well, that's because he had medical care. If you look at the presidents who were shot, Garfield and McKinley, their medical care, they should have survived their shootings nowadays. Lincoln and Kennedy, you know, forget that. So yeah, that was one of the coincidences. We also mentioned Eleanor was sitting with Edith Wilson. Both of them, their husbands were presidents who had strokes. And I don't remember if there was a third one. Robert.
Have you made any of the results ever?
I did not speak to John when I saw him that day. I was lucky enough that somebody was able to get a picture with him in the background to say, hey, I was there. Anybody else? Folks, this was wonderful. Thank you so very, very much. And my big thanks to Mike for setting this up, but also keeping me hands-free. This is a dream. Thank y'all.
Alan, you were fantastic. You always are. Thank you all for coming. It was amazing. What can I say?
Very good.
Yeah.
I mean, wait, I mean, just get it.